So good evening, everyone. Welcome to the City of Fort Lauderdale Historic Preservation Board meeting on July 11th, 2023. I'll call this meeting to order and we'll stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. Where's the flag? To the left. Oh, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Tricia, before we move on, a question. This meeting is being recorded audio and visual?
Yes.
Okay, I didn't see the
There's a camera.
cameras. Hidden cameras, or candid camera.
Straight ahead.
Oh, right in front of me. All right, has everyone had a chance to read the minutes from the last meeting? Actually, first of all, we do have a quorum since I arrived late, so we're a legal entity. And would someone like to make any notes or minutes or motion for the previous minutes from the last meeting? We need a motion to approve the minutes.
I move to approve the minutes.
Is there a second? Second. Seconded by Tim. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The motion carries. Thank you. So that's the minutes. We're going to do the disclosures per project, but we don't have any agenda items today. We're only here for the continuation of the discussion we started at the last meeting about incentives that the City of Fort Lauderdale currently gives, and also to review the Sailboat Bend Historic District material and design guidelines. So let's start with our continued board discussion of incentives. And I wanted to thank Tricia for sending over that list of incentives that the city now offers, because it's great to see it in one place. And we'll wait a moment till Tricia gets back. We just thank you for sending over all of the historic preservation incentives that the city currently offers. Do you want to start the discussion here? Well, because you have, okay.
Yeah, this is really just a continuation of our meeting from last month. I did send over the links that I did from the previous meeting of what was asked to be discussed initially. So that includes our list of incentives that the city offers, which is available on our website, as well as in a printed form if anyone wanted to receive it as a PDF or as a printed document. And then we also have our design guidelines citywide, and then our section of the code that relates to the material and design guidelines for the Sailboat Bend Historic District, which were the items that were listed out a couple of meetings ago through a motion to initiate. Something I did want to point out is on our website, we do have all of this information available. So IT, if you could switch over to the website view for us. We have a lot of information that's available. If you scroll down just a little bit, on the left-hand side, there's a lot of links to different sections of the website. Oops. So there is one that talks about specifically just incentives. There's a couple of videos there. So anytime anyone has any questions or would just like an overview, there's information available for people to view. We also have links specifically to initiatives that Historic Preservation's been working on. So over the past 5 or 6 years, we've done a lot of code amendments, and those are all listed out on the website for anyone that wants to look at, including all of the new incentives that have been implemented over the past few years for waivers for setbacks, distance separation, parking reduction requirements, and the TDR program. And we also did the Strategic Historic Preservation Plan, which I did an overview of a few months ago, just outlining all of the work that went into that, which was funded by a grant program. So there's links to all of this information on the website. I know it's a lot. We also have different story maps. There's a story map specifically for our historic landmarks, and that's on the main page, which gives an outline of all the designated historic landmarks and properties that are listed on the National Register, along with dates of designation. And eventually I'd like to put up links to the actual designation reports, but it's a work in progress. We also have an interactive story map of all the properties in the Sailboat Bend Historic District, as well as a full report on the Sailboat Bend Historic District that was adopted a couple of years ago. So the website is very robust with information and has been added to over the past few years. So there's been a lot of initiatives that the boards asked for through communications to the City Commission and have been then further done by staff in various forms.
Well, I think this is a great beginning. And I'm glad that, I guess, when you meet with potential applicants to the board, do you point this out to them? I mean, or send it to them? Because one of the things I've seen in the past, and of course, when I talk about the past was not as computer-centric as it is today. But we used to give out a handout, just one of these that are folded up 3 times, and just in terms of something to give them and look at as they're talking to them.
Yeah, we do have that. I would say oftentimes we're talking on the phone, we're having Zoom meetings.
Understood.
It's not that often that I'm meeting with people in person.
Okay.
I would say a lot of times it's really a virtual meeting by choice of the applicant. But we're open to either, and we do have a brochure about historic preservation that can be physically given to people. A lot of times it's really giving the links to different sections of the website. If people do want a printed version, we're happy to do that as well.
I was just trying to think of ways to make sure that all of the applicants are aware of the opportunities that they have. Because it seems like many of them come before the board and, they're angry or they're upset and they don't realize that there are a lot of opportunities already enacted by the commission.
Yeah, there are quite a few different options, but not everything is applicable to everyone.
Okay.
So it depends.
So I'm assuming everyone read I had to print them out so I'd remember them. Does anyone have any comments or questions on this part of our discussion today?
I had a suggestion. I mean,
Yeah, great.
we had a great talk last time, and I don't expect to reinvent the wheel, but parking reductions are pretty easy to understand, but I have just, for some clarity, transfer of development rights, TDR program. In simple terms, what are they, and does the person who owns the property that becomes historically designated can transfer those development rights to another property? Now, do they sell that to someone?
So
So it's a commodity.
Yes.
correct, yeah, it's a private real estate transaction between the two parties. So it's the historic property is called the sending site, and they can qualify for calculation of what's available on their site to transfer to another property, a new development that is a qualified receiving site. And so there's specific requirements within the code that say like which area, which properties would be qualified as receiving sites themselves and how much they can receive. So the calculations are for density and then for floor area. The density is pretty straightforward as far as like the number of units that you'd be able to calculate for any given site as what's available for that property to build. And then it's subtracting any existing units on the site. The balance of that would be eligible to transfer. For floor area, it's a little bit more complicated because it has to take into account what the existing building square footage and floor area is to subtract that. So there does have to be some drawings prepared in order to do that, as well as some schematic drawings showing what could be built on the site.
So somebody who wants to develop a big project that's nowhere near the historic property,
Right.
but they buy the development rights from that small property, but the small property only has so much square footage, so to speak, to sell to the big property. And he could actually acquire 8 or 10 historic properties for their development rights and put them all towards his project? Or is he limited to
If
one?
suitable, I mean.
It's
there's-
doable.
If suitable, then it could work. It just depends on everybody's situation.
Okay.
I mean, it's
I was
kind
just
of a
trying
case
to
by
understand,
case. Yeah.
the value when someone has an historic property as an incentive to say, hey,
Right.
there's some light at the end of the tunnel. This is just
Right.
you laying out money every day. There's an opportunity here for you to sell these development rights.
Well, and you might have a single family home in a higher zoned area that they could in reality build a lot more units, but instead they're preserving that structure on the site. And so then they can transfer the balance of those units to
To
a new
anybody
development.
anybody in the city?
Not anybody in the city. There's specific receiving areas that are outlined in the code, and
Okay.
there's specific requirements for that property to receive those units.
I just want to add one thing to what Tricia was saying, is that conceivably, you could have one home in a high development district that could generate a lot of money for the homeowner because of the air rights, because you're basically selling the air rights to a developer.
Okay. And what about flood insurance program that the FEMA historic structure exemptions does that obviously doesn't interfere with any safety feature, but what is that in layman's terms? What does
So
that
there's
mean?
certain requirements for properties when there's a substantial improvement to a building to incorporate flood requirements. So either elevating the structure or to FEMA requirements or flood proofing it in a particular way. And that's done in coordination with our floodplain management group. But when it's a historically designated property, there's certain exemptions where they don't have to incorporate all of those improvements. They can take other steps or nothing if they didn't want to, but there's other methods that are outlined in some directives provided by FEMA specifically for how you can protect your historic structure without elevating it. And then we also have guidelines for property owners that do wish to elevate their structures.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, if you have that historic property, even though you get that consideration from FEMA, can you still get flood insurance if you're not complying with new upgrades? You know what I mean? Like, would they even want to insure you if you're going to be underwater for sure? I wonder how that works.
Yeah, I can't really answer that. I'm not an insurance specialist,
Yeah.
but
Okay.
but it certainly gives some more flexibility to certain property owners. We have had a property owner specifically apply for historic designation to assist with some of the FEMA requirements that would have been imposed on them if they would have not designated.
I got to tell you though, I mean, you worked really hard on this beautiful website and put together something that's was so much needed, and it's a beautiful machine that you built there, and I thank you.
Well, it's partially the city's website. It's just the information and
Yeah,
content
but
that's been added
it's
to it.
organized and it's answering a lot of questions that were asked and not answered. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Anyone else have any comments? I have one question. I had originally sent Tricia a list of some of these things because I didn't realize that they were all in the regulations, which was wonderful. The one item I sent that you didn't understand because it wasn't worded properly, I was questioning whether, in order to preserve a historic structure on a property, in exchange for that preserving, can the property owner get additional height for additions to other buildings on site, contributing buildings, or new buildings on site? This is just another
So it's sort
item.
of like a TDR on site.
Well, no,
Or
it's
it's some sort of an exchange
it's
within the
not-
same property.
In a way, it's a smaller exchange, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
if they can't do a TDR, maybe they get, depending on what the height limit is, they get 1 or 2 extra stories, which sometimes it's very persuasive to a developer or even a homeowner.
We don't necessarily have something prescribed like that in the code, but there's, it just depends on what zoning district you're in, if that's advantageous or not. And then if it would be something that would be appealing to the larger community.
It's just an idea to,
Yeah.
take further if you feel it is necessary.
And as you know, any ideas that you guys come up with, it's something that you would have to communicate to the city commission, and we would have to take directive from the city commission. We can't take directive from the Historic Preservation Board on
Right.
items to pursue.
Is there anything that you're working on that might want to be considered to be included in this list?
The only thing, like, we've been, not necessarily looking, well, we've been researching, but it's a very difficult thing, is to find a funding source, or understand how we could apply a funding source to historic preservation, because that's typically what we're asked for the most, but it's very challenging because, where does the money come from?
That was the
And there's a
question.
lot of restrictions on where it comes from and then how it's applied and who can have it. And it's a very difficult task.
Don't
So
you have to basically shop a grant by grant? Or it could be something else?
Not necessarily. I mean, there's other cities within the state of Florida that might have something like that, but they've been either given money through some other resource in the community, or there's a nonprofit or in the community that runs a grant program for historic property owners. So there's different methods, but it's not usually coming from a grant to start that. It's coming from another source. So there's some other entity that's granting that funding. But
I'm sure you'll find that entity at some point.
yeah, but it is challenging. It's not something that just happens. And well, sometimes it does happen, but it's not something that we can just make happen, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Okay. Anything else from anyone? So that,
Basically, I thought a lot of the things that were on the website were brought up last month and briefly discussed. So a lot of the things that were sent out are existing ones and are nothing new that we can put forward as incentives or extending incentives to preservation in the city of Fort Lauderdale. I had asked at that time if anybody had ever used a lot of these things, and as my impression is that there's rarely anyone who has ever been granted or given one of these incentives as an applicant on historic properties. The only one that I'm aware of that really might be is the FEMA exemption on properties. Otherwise, the ad valorem and the transfer rights, am I correct in understanding that no one's ever really used them?
The ad valorem one, we haven't seen an application come through since I've been here. There is the tax exemption for commercial properties that is utilized regularly. We have multiple properties in the city that utilize it because it's a very straightforward process. And then we also, we have one applicant that's qualified for the TDR program as a sending site, but we haven't had anyone actually do a full transfer yet. The building code exemptions, those are some things that we use kind of on a semi-regular basis to try to make something work for a historic property, to make sure that we're preserving the site. The FEMA ones we definitely use. And then we've used the setback waivers previously. The parking reduction gets used on a regular basis, particularly in the H1 district. But there might be other circumstances where that could be applied depending on the project that's coming before us. So they're used in some capacity, and it's good to have those tools when the occasion arises.
Okay, well, the study that we recently did with the consulting company, there were several things that were brought up that to me were concerns that I have not heard yet, and they might be in the works of how they're going to be addressed. One of which is the rising waters, and we saw a significant of that in April as something that's present. It's not something that could happen, it has happened. So I want to suggest some way of addressing that issue, because what is going to happen is that all of these properties that are contributing or historic are going to be destroyed or ruined because of not protecting those properties. And so I'm looking to maybe even address that, because it came up in last month's meeting that it had to kind of be public funds or public things. It couldn't be to a private property. So how do we go about
I don't
getting
know what you mean
funding?
by that. About getting funding for a climate change?
That's part of it, but like rising seawater from the river and from poor drainage into the streets, or from the streets into the private properties. In Sailboat Bend and plenty of other places in the city of Fort Lauderdale, there is poor drainage. And so that has created problems where the water from the streets is pouring into residential properties. Plenty of them are historic or contributing, and so that is causing damage to those properties. So the city, in my perspective, needs to address some of that rather than reacting to it and not having some accountability for the problems that they are creating.
So it's not holistically a historic preservation issue, but I'll tell you what we have been doing from the historic preservation angle. We did apply for a grant last year to do a vulnerability study of the historic properties within the city, anything that's designated. We were not awarded the grant. The state commented that they are prioritizing communities to do a baseline study first, and the city of Fort Lauderdale has already been awarded that grant for that baseline study, which does include all of the historically designated properties that are city-owned. But they encouraged us to reapply and keep reapplying until the funding does become available for these like second round opportunities. So we'll keep doing that. And then we are in the process of creating a toolbox to put on the website to help with some of the information. And then there's some other initiatives that are outlined in the strategic plan that will just take a little bit more time. I'm not sure if you guys are aware, but we did have another staff person who was here for a few months, and then she left in March, and so we just hired a new planner to work alongside me in historic preservation. And unfortunately, she couldn't be here tonight because she just started. But
Congratulations.
yeah, but she will be
Good.
here for the August meeting for sure.
Great.
Yeah, and then we also have a planning assistant. Our previous planning assistant also left in March, and we have a new planning assistant that just started, and she's back here, Kaylee Linares. So she's here today to help out with the meeting. But it does help to have the extra staff and the extra hands to get some of this work done.
Is this a permanent staff position?
They're permanent positions, correct?
Great.
Yeah.
Great. Did you have any?
So just to follow up with that, because one of the other things that came up was funding like the community redevelopment that has city designated funds for improvements to communities. Those are public funds for public use, right?
That's a little bit, well, that's under a statute that's meant for, that it's separate from historic preservation, so
Right.
it's
But the
different.
city has designated funds for underserved communities.
Well, it's not formulated that way. A lot of the stuff comes from the federal government and then it's funneled out, but it's a CRA funds. It's not deemed as city funds, if you know what I mean. It's
Okay.
different. So it's based on the statutory authority with that. So the issue is to find something that supports what you're requesting.
Well, and that's what I'm inquiring about, is there some opportunity or option for the board to request the city manager and the city commissioners to explore setting aside and designating funds because the city in their strategies every year, they've indicated historic preservation is a top priority. So if it's a top priority, they should be allocating funds to make historic preservation a priority. So where are the funds for that?
Well, just to put it in perspective with the limitation of using funds for private purposes, which is private homes. So if you go to the state website, you go to the Florida Division of Historic Resources. If you actually go there and there's a actual Q&A that says, hey, can I get a grant to rehabilitate my home or business? Then it says, we have grant funds available only for nonprofit organizations, state agencies, projects funded by the Historic Preservation Grants Program must serve the public interest and must be accessible to the public. Therefore, the grants are not available for properties owned by private individuals or for-profit corporations. Then it says, if you are seeking funding assistance for a privately owned historic home or business, you may be eligible for tax reductions, et cetera, et cetera. Then it gives you a link to go to that, a letter that they have provided. And then it goes into detail about, hey, at this time, the state does not give you any grant funds for private individuals, but you may want to check out these other links, would give you links to different sorts of the Florida Trust, the HUD, other resources. But there's nothing here that supports the giving private individuals that sort of funding, but I am definitely looking for it. It's just I haven't found it yet.
Okay, and it's actually not really what I was inquiring about, because I brought up public streets with drainage, seawalls, all of those things, because even driving from downtown Fort Lauderdale to here, you see lots of improvements over the last 20 years. This streets and the street lights, so improvement to all of those public facilities in the historic districts, whether it's the H1 or Sailboat Bend, those things need to be addressed in order to prevent further damage. So the seawalls are public, the streets are with the drainage are public, the sidewalks are public, the street lights are public. All of those things are public accommodations.
But these are under the purview of Public Works.
Right, so it's funding for that then. Where can we get funding to make those a priority for these districts?
I believe there are ongoing projects regarding the drainage, et cetera, that's currently being worked on. There's lots of construction going on with that. So I know that that's being done with the stormwater and all that drainage, especially in light of the flood. So that's happening now.
And there's, on the Public Works website, they have a lot of information on the ongoing projects that are currently funding and planned for funding in the future through their CIP.
Could I jump in here for a minute? So just to be clear, the city has funding for drainage, for public roads, sidewalks, et cetera, for all communities. And if I'm hearing Richard's concern, it feels as though the historic areas, designated areas that are in neighborhoods that don't have drainage aren't getting the attention that some other areas are. Is that what your question is?
Well,
Or you wish
I
that
can
they
use
had
an
more
example.
priority?
In Sailboat Bend, I mean, that's where I live, that's 3 blocks before there are any drainage areas. So all the water sits. It doesn't have an opportunity to drain at all. And there are plenty of areas within Sailboat Bend that is the case. And so the water, as I'm pointing out, goes from the streets, because it's slightly sloped, and into the private properties. And so the private properties are battling the onslaught of water that's not being addressed from drainage, proper drainage in those streets.
And the attention should be there whether or not it was a historic property or not.
True,
That
but like I
would
said,
be, to me, that would be the argument that you could win.
well, but there is this city approach to wanting residents, whether they're, well, not residents really, commercial properties or residents, to preserve their properties. And so the city has not taken necessary steps to help prevent that from happening, because they don't address these ongoing issues.
So-
I'm wondering why they're not a priority and how come they're not being addressed.
So maybe our board could request the schedule for those areas in terms of the drainage program that they have in place that's going through the city to see at what point in time do you plan on digging up these roads and putting more drainages? Because they're doing it everywhere. It was a big deal on Bayview, Middle River and all that. I remember just, right when Dean got elected. So I would imagine that they're probably have some sort of schedule for that neighborhood. Maybe we could get an answer from Public Works. That's my 2 cents.
And I'd like to ask, if I could, maybe Arthur, when I look back at the legislation that gives us the power of this board, and I think about this type of issue, I don't find where it's in our purview. And so I'm sympathetic, 100% agree, but I'm wondering what the vehicle is that should be used to address this challenge.
Thank you. I have a add-on, is that I was thinking the same thing, and I'm sure you've tried it, but wouldn't this, because it's not quite, doesn't seem to be in the purview of the board, but obviously the city should be supplying something there, as they are equally in other neighborhoods. My question is, would this not be something you'd go through your commissioner? Because it's involving boards and committees and different departments.
I don't know. I feel like historic preservation means there's something coming the way that's gonna, if this building's gonna be underwater, we need to ask the city what are we gonna do about it before the historically preserved building is no longer with us.
All right, I'm just bringing this up because I think it's a purview for this board to make a request
Absolutely.
for the city manager and the city commissioners to consider addressing these deficiencies and either changing the priorities if it's a top priority for historic preservations. So elevating those areas of the city to be addressed sooner rather than later, because they are historic buildings and they have a higher risk as a result of that. It does say in our powers and duties in number A that we are not limited by these 9 items, but we can do things that are beyond those 9 that are listed. So if we choose as a board to make recommendations, I think that that is part of our opportunities as a historic preservation board.
Why don't we listen to our assistant city attorney at this point?
So the city, has a lot of boards and committees. So just, I do know on the Public Works website, they have referenced that they provide information regarding the storm management services to the Infrastructure Task Force and the Council of the Fort Lauderdale Civic Associations. And I do know that there's some board that handles the infrastructure issues as well. So if you would like to say that, but the stormwater issue is a citywide issue and it's not unique to historic preservation. And they also do have like stormwater assessments, so people have to pay for that. So, just so you know, I'm putting that out there. It's on your taxes if you see it, there's stormwater assessments. So if you want to get into that, fine. We can possibly get Public Works here to talk to you if that's a request. But if you'd like to just send a message to the City Commission to consider historic properties, that, I don't know what the schedule or the plan is, but I do know for sure that the stormwater issue is being worked on throughout the city. It's just a matter of the time period of how long it takes, and they will get to who they need to get to. It just takes time.
So in the past, we've had city officials come and speak to the board. And what do you think of the idea of having the head of Public Works or somebody in authority come and answer some of the questions you've raised?
Well, last month we also brought up having a charrette, but I think that there was pushback on that. An alternative that I might suggest to deal with this question and plenty of others is to have focus groups. Focus groups don't necessarily have the same roundabout with a charrette, but they allow specific groups on specific categories, meaning like you have 5 select or random architects meet. You have 5 general contractors meet to see what their insights and their experiences may be to provide greater incentives for historic preservations. That's just an example. And you can have the city officials meet, with it being city works or different people that might be able to brainstorm or to get focus groups to address some of these issues. And you'd have to, again, have like a consulting company, like we did before, come in and manage that. So again, it's going back to asking the city manager or the commissioners to provide funding for whatever that might be to do those focus groups, to gather information that might help to create the incentives to make these properties that we designated as historic relevant.
I hear what you're saying, and I think it's absolutely correct. I agree with it, but might not be the first step to hear what the city's doing already and what they're planning to doing in terms of the districts of the city before we start really going further.
Well, part of the point of focus groups is to get outside ideas and concepts. I don't know how much city staff is reaching out to general contractors, private residents, to architects, these individuals, to get that feedback of non-biased, ideas that might be incentives for these properties.
But this is who we ask, right? Wouldn't you want to start with him and ask if he's involved anybody else?
Why don't we make our recommendation to, our ask to the city is to just get an update on where these, for lack of, these 2 neighborhoods that you just referred to, where are they on the schedule for storm drain improvements?
Right.
And if we get they're not, then we pick it up and go deeper.
Well, either way, I think you'd want to have him here just to answer your question.
No question about it, but I mean, we could go round and round and round with philosophy on it. And who's getting ready to dig a hole? I think he would like to know that something's going to be done and be done soon.
Okay.
And I think it should, I don't know that we could ever get it as a priority because of the way it was described as private property versus public property, and that's kind of tricky. But it's a neighborhood in our city, and it deserves attention. So that would be the angle I would go at it with, just to get attention on it. That's my suggestion.
Tricia?
If you would like to have someone from Public Works come to speak to the board and give an overview of what projects are occurring specifically in Sailboat Bend, we can make that request. And I'm not sure, it depends on availability, if they could come in August or a later
Well,
meeting.
sooner is better. And we're giving them a month notice, so maybe
Yeah.
they can,
We can make a
show up.
request and
okay,
see.
okay. Do we need to vote on anything?
I do suggest that you vote on it.
Can I make a motion that we request the Public Works Department come to update us and apprise us of what are the current activities that are going on to prevent or to manage the drainage and seawall issue in the city's historic districts.
Good. Is there a second?
Just a representative, correct?
Well, a representative who knows what's happening. So I'd like to say a representative in authority, but I don't want to limit it. But someone who knows especially what's happening citywide and someone who knows specifically in the 2 historic districts.
Okay.
Second.
Seconded by Tim. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The motion carries. Okay, and if I have one other item I wanted to talk about in this subject before we move on to the Sailboat Bend. But when I was reading through the architectural styles, I noticed that there are no category or examples of mid-century modern in the commercial or multi-family residential. There are small hotels and there are residences, but I think this is such an important feature. I really think that when this was written, I have forgotten the date, but it was a number of years ago, that the consciousness of our treasures of mid-century was not quite as common and they may not have picked it up, but I do think the report should be updated to include that period.
Yeah, that is something that is in our comprehensive plan to update the design guidelines
Okay,
at some point. And it'll probably be something we would need to apply for a grant for.
okay. And one other quick question. I know you have some very comprehensive surveys of other neighborhoods in the city that have not been designated yet, and I remember reading through them. And I remember a number of the buildings in there would be listed as, I don't know what you want to call it, we had a case last month about this, a potential architectural landmark, but it's either not old enough or but by the quality of its architecture.
Yeah, a potential individually designated resource or potential historic district.
My question is anywhere, is there a list of these potential landmarks?
So on the website, at the bottom of the left-hand bar within the historic preservation section, there is a link to architectural resource surveys. And if you click on that link, then there is an interactive map that shows all of the potential,
great.
all the properties that were identified as potential landmarks or districts in the past surveys.
Thank you.
And this kind of leads into a question that I have. An example of what you're talking about, Arthur, might be considered the Broward County Public Library there. It is not 50 years old, but it's been designated historic because of its architectural elements or style. And so I'm looking at, and I know that there's a little bit of going to be controversy with this, but City Hall, it is a brutalist building that's mid-century modernist. Do we try to approach that as a historic designation and preserving it before the city or somebody else comes along and tries to tear it down?
We'd have to agree that it was something, that it would be a landmark. I personally disagree.
Well, because it's a representation of brutalist style of architecture that is rare in Fort Lauderdale, and so it's an example of what the architecture was during the period it was built in 1969. So it does fall into both architectural and the time period of being designated historic.
My only comment would be, it does all that, but does it rise to the level of significance? And that's always the bottom line question.
I'll just say that the owners of that building
Want to tear it down?
will probably say no, and they're the ones who have the final say in it. So, if we each went to one of our commissioners and said, how do you feel about it? I mean, it's more of a budgetary thing for them at this point, I think. So I don't think their heart's in the idea of preserving it for historic preservation. I'm just
And Tim-
brutally honest.
And Tim, one of them,
Dollars are going to win that one.
One of them
Well-
is listening to you right now.
Okay, hi. Who's listening?
Yeah, well, and I'm also going to point out that there is a Florida Preservation Grant Fund that you might be able to get funds for that particular type of architecture or building. So that's money that might be available, that might not otherwise be available to
It doesn't
preserve.
hurt to ask. See what they say.
I would suggest, if you haven't already, to watch or listen to the last commission meeting regarding the issue pertaining to City Hall, as well as where some funding is coming from as it pertains to the federal government. I don't want to repeat anything, but you can watch it yourself.
Okay, and then there's another property. It's actually not in my district, but because one of the incentive is for commercial properties, I feel okay with bringing this property up at 1313 South Andrews. It was a Francis Abreu property built in 1926. And it's not designated by knowledge, and so I would like to see if we could explore that, reaching out to the property owners or doing some research on it to see if that's a viable property that we can add into the historic preservation resources in the city of Fort Lauderdale.
So the board can always make a motion to place on an agenda as a discussion item. We've done this before. If there's interest in talking about a potential designation, to include that as for under the good of the city and invite the property owner to participate in that discussion. I will say that property owner has reached out previously about the potential of designation, but we have not received an application.
So maybe it's opportune to reach out at this point.
But it would require a motion.
Okay. Would anyone like to make a motion?
Okay, I'll make a motion for placing the property at 1313 South Andrews on the agenda for further discussion and evaluation for historic preservation.
You meant historic designation, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
And would you like to invite the property owner?
Yes, of course.
And is there a second?
What is the property?
Picture. So it looks like it's single.
It's currently a law firm, I think, but it is currently for sale as well. So it is a commercial property use, and so they could apply for that 20% tax incentive. So that's why I'm saying it has a significant incentive to be designated.
And this is just a discussion with the owners of the property to see if they're interested?
Exploration of it
An
being,
explanation. This is not us saying that we are definitely
Right.
voting to declare it historic.
Tricia just said that the owner is interested in looking at this.
Were they interested, the
They've
current owners?
expressed interest, but I have not received an application for designation.
I'm in favor of
Can
it
I
as long
see-
as we're not, imposing it on the owner.
right, and I agree. I mean,
And so
I'm
we-
not looking to impose anything on anyone. I'm just saying these are things that we should explore and make this information available if they're currently not available or
Right.
not knowledgeable of the situation.
In that case, I would second it.
Okay. So we have a motion. We have a second.
Ashley, did you have a question? Or-
Sorry, Ashley.
So I just want to make sure we are taking a piece of property that an applicant has not come to us, but you have talked to this property owner?
I have talked to the representative for the property owner previously about the potential for designation, but I have not received an application for designation.
And did you let them know of all of the information available on site, on our website, about what the benefits of designated a property would be?
Yes, they were specifically inquiring about the TDR program.
And they have not come back to you. So we as a board are now bringing this back up and asking the property owner to come talk about a piece of property, making it historic that they have not.
We've done this repeatedly in the past.
Maybe. I mean, I don't, like,
yeah,
I just,
And you're correct, though.
It's similar to the Ferguson property that recently came up
Right.
and we've not resolved. There's a property that is a commercial property on Federal Highway, which is currently the Ferguson Furniture and Decoration Supplies for property. And we've not resolved that yet. So we've
What
had
is
a
that?
discussion with it. We've tried to see if we could get it designated historic, and that has not happened yet. I think we've had some difficulty in getting the owners to come and talk and to explore that. So I'm not asking for it to be designated. I'm asking for an exploration of having this property potentially designated
and when-
with cooperation from the owner.
And in
So-
doing this, I'm sorry, there's no vote that would be given. It's only for discussion.
so just back to the Ferguson example that you just cited. So we, as the board here, the Historic Preservation Board, brought up the Ferguson property on Federal Highway, invited the property owner to come appear with our board to discuss
Right.
the possibility of declaring it historic, and they just have not come.
So
Well,
in that case, they did not come to that meeting. However, the board did move forward with initiating a
Designation.
designation application. And so that was initiated by the Historic Preservation Board. Historic Preservation staff prepared the application. It came to the Historic Preservation Board, who recommended approval. And now it's going before the City Commission, and it's currently scheduled for August 22nd at the City Commission meeting.
So this board put in an application for a property to be designated. That application came back to this board to vote on, and we
So-
voted
No.
on
So with
it?
any historic designation application, it can be initiated by a few different entities.
Sure.
One is the Historic Preservation Board. They can initiate an application through a motion. The City Commission can do the same. The property owner themselves can do it, and if there's multiple property owners, it would need to be a simple majority, like in the
But-
case of a district.
But with the Ferguson application, this board was the one that submitted the
The
application.
instigator.
Historic Preservation Board initiated the application. So it's an initiation asking staff to prepare the application.
So the applicant is the city commission. When it's initiated by this board, then the board does a motion saying, we would like to initiate an application for designation of that property. And then Tricia will prepare the materials, but the applicant on the documents is the city of Fort Lauderdale.
Okay. And then it comes back to this board for a vote.
Correct.
That seems
Ultimately,
very ironic to me.
yeah.
Seems like a conflict of interest.
Well,
But
You mean
I
that
understand.
we are permitted to propose a building for designation?
That we as a board could say, oh, I think this property is historic. You prepare an application. Oh, it's coming back. We said that it should be an application. Now we are the deciders if it moves forward. Yeah, I do. I think it's ironic to me. It seems a little bit of a conflict. I understand that recently or within the last year that was changed to where we could submit application. But yeah, I do think that's a conflict for the application to originate with this board and then this board be the decider before it goes to the commission.
So
I think it's very
Question
much a
for
conflict.
Tricia, isn't this a state law?
No, it's a city, it's in the city code, isn't it?
It's a city code. It's not uncommon in other municipalities for that to occur. And each municipality might have a little bit different situation. In some cases, the Historic Preservation Board does the final designation. It doesn't move forward to the city commission unless it's an appeal. In our case, there's two different groups that are voting, and in some cases, like a historic district, it would go to Planning and Zoning Board as well. So the Historic Preservation Board, in the case of a designation application, is a recommending body, and the city commission is the deciding body.
It's similar to the Planning and Zoning Board. So they have the authority to recommend to the city commission, consider a land use plan amendment or consider changing the code to change the parking requirements, et cetera. And that has to go through the Planning and Zoning Board before it gets to the city commission. So that's how it is here, where originally the code had, when Tricia and I got here 5.5 years ago, it was anyone in the city of Fort Lauderdale could apply for an application to designate someone else's property. There was a lot of public outreach as well as internal discussions with how we would possibly amend the code to make it better for some people who were concerned about anyone being able to designate their property. So we came up with an alternative where there were only a few different ways that someone can designate a property, which is the board, in light of the qualifications you all have, to tell us, hey, consider this for an application. You're not presenting us with any hardcore evidence at that time. Tricia is doing the research, so she'll present a full packet to you of what that property entails. So it's not like you're bringing us an actual application and you're saying file this. It's just you may see a property and you're saying, okay, prepare something. And at that point, Tricia has the authority in her application to say that she does not recommend it for designation. There have been some applications that have gone before the city commission where her staff report does say that she does not recommend it for designation. So it doesn't mean that it will be designated. It's just you do that motion and then you say, hey, staff, consider that, and then she'll bring it for you, and then you'll look at the evidence at that time. So we came up with just the city commission. The board can, ask staff to prepare the application, and then a nonprofit corporation that has been involved in historic preservation for the past 5 years, and then the individual property owner. And then for districts, it has to be a simple majority. So we went from anyone to that. So we just thought it was legally the best way to do it, similar to how the recommendations from the Planning and Zoning Board.
For me, I'm just bringing it to the attention of the city, not necessarily saying that we should do it, but not having the knowledge or the research to gather that information. So, like I said, I'm just bringing it to the attention of the city to look at it as a candidate.
I just think that when this board goes to a property owner and says, we want to talk to you about preserving your property as a property owner, I would take that as a hostile, like, I would not think that that would be a welcoming, I would, if this particular property owner wanted their property deemed historic, they would go through that process to do that. And I think it's just not, I find this problematic. So I know it's up to the board, but I just think that that is a step that is proactive in us trying to approach people. And I just think that people have property rights, and I just don't think that that is something we should be doing.
Ashley, I agree with your intent and what you're saying, but coming back to the same comment I made earlier, this does seem to be directly in our purview, that we are specifically told to recommend. And so I don't know if there are 50 of these and what the staff resource issue might be. That'd be my only concern, but it does appear, and I think it would be a good broader discussion for us, but it seems like one of our charges is go identify this property, that property, and just let them know that they have the opportunity.
One thing, I'm sorry.
I think the issue with that is it's not required by code to invite the property owner here. In fact, the United States Supreme Court has ruled already on the issue of property rights when it pertains to historic preservation that the property owner's consent is not required. That's under the United States Supreme Court in the Penn Central case. So legally, how it was before was actually fine. That was challenged at the Supreme Court level, and the local government prevailed. But I think the issue with this board in the past is that they wanted to hear from the property owner as it pertains to how they felt about the application. And I think there was one hearing that we had where we invited 3 different property owners, and I think 2 came and contested it, and the board decided to abandon the idea. And then 1, I think, didn't show up, and that's
Right.
where we're at right now with that one that's on the August agenda. And so I think the purpose of it is not to be, confrontational. I think the intent, at least how the board indicated to me previously, was that it was to hear from the property owner and then decide at that point whether or not they wanted to move forward with the recommendation to Tricia.
And just as a backstory to this was, the board, before you were on the board, originally requested the designation of 10 mid-century buildings. And after we had a hearing or 2 and everything whittled down to just the Ferguson's building. So I agree with you that we don't want to be confrontational. But what we found in the past, as we learned today, is sometimes owners are very willing to talk about preservation, but you have to bring it out of them. I mean, if they're not, they're going to come and tell you why they're not. But I think this is a good opportunity to put out our listing of incentives for historic preservation, because this is where you give them something.
I have a question, Sherry. The Supreme Court ruled that it does not need consent of property owner to
Right.
declare historic preservation. But does the city of Fort Lauderdale, state of Florida, or Broward County have the option to say that they don't practice that law?
So we can change our code right now and say, hey, it's only property owner that's required. But right now, how our code is there's 4 different ways to designate, and 3 of them don't require the property owner's consent.
But the city does have the option to change that and say that it does require a property owner's consent.
That's correct. We
Okay.
can change the code.
So to Ashley, that is one of the reasons why I came to this board. That's truthfully the very reason I came to this board, because I felt that there isn't enough to impose historic preservation on a property owner. There isn't enough economic incentive. There isn't enough help, so to speak. I had no disregard for historic preservation or disrespect for what it represents, but I did have a great amount of consideration for the property owner. And in this case, I supported Richard's motion with the idea that it would just be a discussion, but I can tell you honestly that if that property owner came back here and it came before us for a vote and they were against it, I would vote against it. So it is a little tricky, and I am walking a thin line by saying, yes, let's explore it. But I'm looking for steps in the right direction, and I want the city to hear from the property owners. And I'm trying to find vehicles that'll educate the public so that when these issues come up, we're not sitting here sorting everything out and telling everybody what aisle it's on and how much it costs and where to get it and blah, blah, blah. I mean, we'd like to get an educated consumer on this subject matter, and these are steps in the right direction. That's where I'm at with this. Tricia was terrific with me when I was scared to death that my property where the Parrot Lounge is was going to be considered historic and or my entire neighborhood, because I had no clue what that meant, and I was going on a whole bunch of, spooky stuff. Once it got cleared up, I got a little bit more relaxed about it, but knew that if there was going to be change, I would have to participate. So that's where I'm at with this. I'm on your side with this idea, but I'm also on the side of exploration to say, hey, if you guys are interested, let's do it. And if they say no, then I say, then we won't do it. That's where I'm at.
So we have a pending motion on the table. I think we should vote on it, unless anybody has something critical to the motion. We have a motion by Richard. We have a second by Tim. All in favor? Say aye. Aye. Opposed? The motion carries.
Opposed?
No? Okay. So we're just going to invite,
Or
do we just
send a letter to them, Richard?
well, how does Tricia usually do it?
I send a letter to the
Send a
property
letter.
owner
Okay.
inviting them to the board meeting. In this case, I believe I have the property owner's representative's email address, so I can try to reach out that way as well.
Okay.
Now, when it comes to the property owner's consent, we as a board can make that a mandatory thing, that we have the property owner's consent. Is that what I'm hearing?
We didn't know, yeah.
You can recommend that we change the code to require that, because there are 4 ways to do it, and 3 of them don't require their consent.
Okay, and then if that happens, how does that fall into any homes that are considered contributing, like in Sailboat Bend? Because you are forcing all of those property owners without their consent to be designated as contributing. Does that suddenly create a domino effect or problem if those owners say, I don't want it designated as contributing?
So with the Sailboat Bend situation, that district has already been designated. So whether or not it's contributing is based on the surveys, the actual surveys that we produced, was it last year or the year before? And it's attached to the resolution. That's where it's distinguished between contributing and non-contributing. But the actual designation of the district, it was done a long time before we got here, so, yeah.
Right, and that was done in like 1992, I believe. But a lot of those property owners, from my knowledge, had been opposed to their properties being designated as contributing. And they had no real say in the motion that was put forward to make them contributing. So that, again, falls into property owners not wanting it designated contributing because they didn't consider it contributing.
Are you saying that they opposed the resolution we did to distinguish? Because before we did it last year, the year before, there was no list of contributing and non-contributing. That was nowhere in the city. Are you saying they contest that, or the actual designation of the historic district?
No, not the historic district. That was before a lot of property owners were there, and there probably were plenty in that scenario too. But when it was approved for contributing, non-contributing, plenty of those property owners came before this board and the city commissioners opposed to the specifics of that designation. So again, does it go back to opening it up, that Pandora's box of these people have the same opportunity to say, I don't want my property designated as contributing because that infringes upon my rights? I
think the thing is with our code, there's the regulations that we currently have, it doesn't penalize someone for being contributing, except to the contrary. It actually has the incentive written in there for those that are contributing. So I think the issue is, unless you can point to some sort of code provision that penalizes someone for being contributing, I'm not quite sure how useful that would be, because we don't distinguish it in the code. That's the issue. Everyone is subject to the same regulations.
That's true, but I think there's plenty of properties that when they come before this board for approval on something, it's significantly pointed out, this property is contributing. So you pay more attention to whether or not it would be approved for its application versus someone who is not contributing, that you think, all right, it's not as important. So it does make a difference.
I just can tell you about what the code says as your lawyer, the board's lawyer. I can't tell you to evaluate something that's not in the code, you know? So if I were to tell you that, that would be bad legal advice. It's just not in the code. That's the issue.
So is
Do
your
we need to pause?
question,
We don't have a quorum at the moment.
We have to wait for Arthur to continue our discussion?
Just because of the fact that if you possibly do a motion, you could possibly make a.
Okay, so he needs to
yeah.
be here for
So
the
let's just
information. Okay. Well, I'll take this opportunity to tell you about the specials at the world famous Parrot Lounge. Food and drink. If anyone at home is listening.
Free advertising?
Will White?
You get a bill from the city. Sorry, we need a quorum.
I was just gonna ask if, I was just gonna ask, so I understood what your question was, Richard. So were you, let me just make sure I'm paraphrasing. You're basically asking that if the code was changed to require a property owner's support of a historic designation, if that would have an impact on any way that the city looks at contributing properties? Because it wouldn't go backwards, it would only be forwards, right? If they change the code, it would only affect future applications for historic a property being designated historically significant. So it wouldn't affect the 3 districts that are already designated, correct? Am I understanding your question?
All right, I understand how you're phrasing it now, and in other words, that any property that was designated contributing is grandfathered in, so it would always be contributing at that point, rather than having the opportunity to say yay or no, that they do not want their property designated contributing. All the properties in Sailboat Bend are automatically in a historic district, so
Right.
every property gets that designation. But it's the contributing, non-contributing aspect that suddenly becomes a question of, well, if I didn't give your approval of designation for contributing, can I rescind that?
Can
From
I,
backwards.
Yeah.
yeah, can I
Right.
just elaborate more, because I didn't get, it's not just the tax incentive, right? If we pull up the code on this screen, I don't think you want that. Okay, and I'll tell you why. Because the incentives that we passed, they apply a lot to contributing properties. So I would suggest, you know, you may want to review some of the incentives in 4732, the non-conforming structure. It says designated historic landmarks and contributing properties located in historic districts are eligible for waivers. You want to review the TDR section, which is 4736.1, 4717.5, where we have the incentive about the distance separation and the yard reduction. I just want to emphasize the fact that if you look at the incentives, it's benefits contributing properties.
Yes, I would generally agree with you, but I'm just indicating there are certain property owners that may not want it. So that gives them the opportunity, as you're saying, for a property that is not interested in this to opt out.
But I guess if it's already in a district and it's already designated as contributing, and if they did change the code, it wouldn't go backwards, it would go forward, right? Like they're already in a district, so they're already, but yeah, right, so then but it would create, say, in the area around Parrot Lounge, if they wanted to designate that as historic and your property, it would make sure that anything done in the future would require property owner support.
That would happen if it happened tomorrow, but let's just say I got designated 10 years ago, and I've been taking the tax reduction, I've been taking the incentives, and I've been exercising the historic preservation incentive package. I think that's where a huge can of worms gets opened. And, do you have to refund all that to the county in order to be exempt now? So if you took the position that, hey,
Oh, I
this
see
is
what you're
great,
saying.
you guys didn't ask me 10 years ago, I'd like to get out. So if you were doing this with any businessman, he'd say, sure, now give me back all that money I gave you, and you can go wherever you want to. So I don't know that we would be able to introduce that idea with a rollback. I think if we introduce that idea to the commission, we'd probably have to introduce it as moving forward, from this day forward, all designation has some sort of new language that would require ownership's consideration. And maybe with their consideration, we also make it even more incentivized with other things. We can package it to make it put a really nice bow on it, so to speak.
Because I do think there's a difference, like as a property owner, when you buy into a historic district and you purchase a home. If you purchase a home in Sailboat Bend, if you have a good realtor and you do your due diligence, you would know you're buying into a historic district. That's part of purchasing that property and understanding that that's part of a responsibility that you have as a homeowner of purchasing a place in that area.
And Tricia's staff has done a great job in kind of flagging that area now. That's one of the changes that was made in the last several years. I believe it's on the Broward County tax rolls now. If you purchase a place like that, it tells you that. And that was one of the issues that we had with residential purchases. People came in and said, we had no idea.
And that's when we have the assessor come here.
Exactly. So we made some progress there, and we're making more progress. Baby steps are better than no steps. And we're making a lot of progress. I mean, I'm very happy that we are, but I think this step is another step that needs to be made, but it does come with a tremendous amount of challenge.
I will kind of step in with the defense of a lot of property owners. I myself have lived in historic properties in London, Boston, New York, San Francisco, so I was familiar with historic preservation. Plenty of people in Florida in particular, where there's not much history or historic preservation, are not familiar with the process and what the requirements are. And so they're naive or uneducated in the process. And so it is a big surprise to anyone who has not been introduced to that, to first time introduction. So, they may be aware, but they don't necessarily understand what's involved.
So I have a question. I was late for the vote, or we did vote?
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry.
It was 4-1.
And anything else on this topic before we move to the next topic? Although we've covered part of it already. So now we want to talk about the Sailboat Bend Historic District Material and Design Guidelines. Anyone have any comments, questions?
Was there anything specific that we were going to talk about with that?
I think I have some suggestions. One is, we've always talked about, or I've always talked about, I should say, that the Sailboat Bend District should be subdivided into two similar, they're not similar, but parts of the district. One along Broward Boulevard and then the rest of Sailboat Bend. We've often talked about this, it came up with the police department, and that the guidelines for the police department were pretty much the same as for a single-family house in Sailboat Bend. Is this a good idea? Because I know it's come up a number of times with other, there was an automobile detailing place or something along Broward Boulevard also.
So are you just talking about the guidelines
Well,
being
the
different for
guidelines-
different areas, or actually having two different districts?
I'd have to open that for discussion. I don't know what is better. I mean, I think I was just suggesting not having two different districts, but having different guidelines for the portions abutting
Yeah.
Broward Boulevard.
So we have been working on a draft update for the Sailboat Bend material and design guidelines, and that was brought forth to the Historic Preservation Board a few years ago, and then we ultimately pulled it back. We didn't move it forward. We went and met with the Sailboat Bend Civic Association.
Is that
a
when
small-
we had an open meeting here? I don't know if that was part of that discussion.
Yeah, it was at the same time when we were
Okay.
discussing the contributing and non-contributing properties. We were also looking at the code updates. But after discussing it with the Civic Association, a small working group was formed to talk about all the different sections and the different code changes. So we did do that due to a number of circumstances. It hasn't completely moved forward and gone back, but we're close to being done. And it's been a little bit of a struggle without staff to help out with some of the tasks, but hopefully we can move it forward in the near future to take it back to the Civic Association to have at least an overview discussion of what it looks like now. But it does separate out some additional guidelines for the commercial properties
Okay, good,
specifically.
good.
So,
I
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
I have one
Go ahead.
other, go ahead, I'll do the same.
Well, I was just curious, like, what, I think, the way I'm hearing Arthur's request and your response is that we might have a commercial guideline that's a little bit different than the residential guideline for material and design, which would make the police department not fall under the residential requirement? Is that what you were suggesting?
Well,
Yeah, in some ways. I mean, there's certain things that are consistent across the board, but then there's a separate section that
Yeah, it's
addresses some of the
it's
commercial
already in
issues.
existence for commercial
Yeah.
requirement, but my question, not to get off of it, is like, if this is open tonight, is when a family comes here and they have to replace material on their historic home, and it's damn near impossible for them to get the material, or economically, unfeasible. Whether it's the wood or the shingles or the siding or the door or the glass or whatever. What wiggle room do we have just to say, okay, that whatever they come with a vinyl window instead of a wooden window that looks similar or same, we still have that ability to say it's acceptable?
So within our current regulations, we already approve aluminum replacement windows that are impact rated without going through the board. So
That's wonderful.
That's typically done at staff level.
How long ago did we do that with the,
Since I've started here.
Okay, cool.
But we do not allow vinyl in our code. And then we also, if there's a change in design or style of the window, then typically, at least in the past couple of years, I've been taking it through the 15-day administrative process, which you all get an email about letting you know that is a change in design, but it agrees with our code. So it doesn't come through the board, the full process where they're waiting on something. So there is that flexibility. And there's other situations where there might just be a material that's not available anymore. We had a recent roof material that the property owners couldn't locate and it wasn't available in the state of Florida, but they found something similar that was asphalt shingle, and I took it through the 15-day process, so you all got an email about that. It was also not, there was no determination on what the actual original roofing material was. So historic photos showed it kind of like a white, so it could have just been a rolled asphalt rather than an actual shingle. So
Yeah,
they were
and
trying to come as
You know, the
close in
reason I
compliance
brought
as
it up
possible.
was, again, it's just a question of educating the potential property owner that says, yes, I want to do that. But, you know, try to minimize the amount of surprises that they might get when they find out that the availability to keep up with this preservation process could be arduously long and expensive. So just so they understand what parameters they have to work in.
Yeah, but also, I'm sorry, also you have to realize that's part of the owner's due diligence when they're buying a property. Because we've had many owners come here and say, oh, I didn't know it was historic. But we've also had the property assessor put it on the cards. So they
Yeah.
should know from the realtor or someone that it's their responsibility to know that.
Well, I just want them to know that if you can't find that particular product in Florida, or that you could go before the board and, or go to staff and say, hey, I've got a situation here, and then we're willing to work with them.
We do that all the time. I have one more question about something that's come up repeatedly at the boards. We've had a number of fences in Sailboat Bend that are higher than 3 feet, which I think is too short. And also, right now, the code only permits vertical wood members, and a number of people have already applied, and we've agreed with them for horizontal wood members. Is that something you're including?
I know we're definitely including the height and, you know, the added height of 4 feet as something that would qualify for administrative approval rather than
Right.
going to the board. And I'm not sure we were specific on horizontal or vertical. I think it just says wood as a material.
Perfect, because we've had to change that too many times over the years.
Yeah, but
Okay,
But it is a process to
Of
get
course.
anything approved as far as a code amendment. And of course, like, our first step would be to present the current draft to the Civic Association.
okay.
Now, follow up into Arthur's comment about the boundaries or changing the district, such as Sailboat Bend. I have also raised that as a concern, especially when the police department came up. And it just seems like that area, the boundaries for the Sailboat Bend district has been altered, from my knowledge, several times since it has been established. And I think that's one of the things that this board can do if we think it's relevant to change some of those boundaries. Meaning, like, the police station, the PUD are really not structures that fall into the typical Sailboat Bend area. So you could say we could split them up, yes, and anything that is west of that, currently in Sailboat Bend, designate a different area like Valentino, because I think that was the original plot area that was labeled for that area, and anything in between, it was like Waverly or something, because not an entire Sailboat Bend community is in a historic district. These are H1 already, there's Sailboat Bend, and so they're divided by a lot of commercial space, like the Performing Arts Center. So Sailboat Bend has that confusion already of it having a district and having a historic district. And so I don't know if that's necessary to leave it in its current structure.
There's the Sailboat Bend Civic Association, which covers a broader area. But there was a proposal several years ago that did show an adjustment to the Sailboat Bend Historic District boundaries, but it did not move forward. The Historic Preservation Board recommended denial to the City Commission and Senate Communication, and it did not move forward past the Historic Preservation Board.
And just to add, what I was, in my thoughts were not to have two separate districts, because I think the back of the commercial lots on the south side of Broward Boulevard directly abut the historic district. And I think there needs to be not only control of what's happening on these lots, but how they interact with their neighbors. So that was my concern. Anyone else have any comments or anything? Tricia, is there anything else to discuss?
Just as an update, the code amendment to add thematic historic districts was not approved last week by the city commission.
Did they give a reason? I'm sorry, I didn't know about it. I would have tried to have been there. Because I know that they were depending upon
I don't think
the
there was-
planning and zoning, which I thought was totally
I
not right.
suggest watching the meeting.
Okay, thank you.
The Infrastructure Task Force Advisory Committee is the one that handles the stormwater suggestions and all that. Just wanted to make sure I was clear on that. Thank you.
With that, if there's nothing else, is there?
Motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn. Do I have a second?
Yes.
And the motion is seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
No one opposed, then the motion carries, and have a good night.
Thank you. Thank you, Tricia.
Is our August meeting the training?
No, the August meeting is a regular meeting.